If you are drawn to the untold struggles that shaped nations long before crowns gleamed and banners flew high, then stay with me, because what you are about to witness is not the legend of kings, but the endurance of ordinary people. Subscribe now and walk beside them through frost-bitten fields and smoke-choked villages into a world where survival was the only law that truly mattered. The year is 900 AD. England is not yet England as we know it, but a fractured land stitched together by fear, faith, and iron. The old Roman roads still cut across the countryside like fading scars, their stones cracked and swallowed by weeds. Once they carried legions. Now they carry rumors of Viking sails on the horizon, of burned villages, of kings rising and falling before harvest returns. The empire that once brought order has been gone for centuries, and in its absence, smaller kingdoms claw at one another for dominance. In the southern lands, Wessex stands as a stubborn shield against the north. Beyond its borders lies the Danelaw, territory carved out by Scandinavian settlers who came first as raiders and then as rulers. These were not distant invaders anymore. They were neighbors, traders, sometimes allies, sometimes executioners. A farmer plowing his narrow strip of land could not be certain which lord's banner would fly above him next winter. Allegiance was less about loyalty and more about survival. For the ordinary villager, life begins before dawn. A thin gray light spreads over fields scratched from stubborn soil. The land itself is demanding, often waterlogged in winter and brittle in summer. Crops fail easily. A poor harvest means hunger. 2 poor harvests mean death. There are no safety nets, no granaries stocked by distant governments. What is grown must last. Barley, wheat, rye, each stalk matters. Livestock is wealth, but animals require protection from thieves as much as wolves. Homes are built from timber frames packed with wattle and daub, roofs thick with thatch. Smoke seeps through the air from central hearths because chimneys are rare luxuries. Inside, entire families sleep together for warmth. Privacy is unknown. Survival is communal. Children learn quickly that their hands are needed, gathering firewood, tending animals, carrying water from streams that may freeze over in the depths of winter. And winter in 900 AD is not poetic. It is merciless. Cold creeps into bones and lingers. Illness spreads easily in cramped quarters. A cough can become a fever, and a fever can become a funeral within days. There are no physicians as we understand them, only herbal remedies and whispered prayers. Monks in distant monasteries copy sacred texts by candlelight, preserving fragments of knowledge. But for the common villager, faith is medicine, and survival is proof of divine mercy. Fear travels faster than horses. The sight of sails along the eastern coast sends entire settlements into panic. Viking longships glide silently up rivers, appearing where walls are weakest. Raids are swift. They target monasteries heavy with silver chalices and gold reliquaries, but villages are not spared. Livestock is stolen. Young men are cut down. Women and children may be taken as captives. Smoke rising from thatched roofs becomes a signal that spreads terror across miles of countryside. In response, communities fortify. Wooden palisades rise around settlements. Watchmen scan horizons from crude towers. The concept of the Burh fortified towns begins to define defense. These are not grand castles of stone, but earthen ramparts reinforced with timber. Within their walls, trade flickers cautiously back to life. Markets appear, small and vulnerable, yet vital. Salt, iron tools, wool, grain. Each exchange is a step toward fragile stability. Warriors hold a special place in this society. Then, loyal to a king, commands respect. His sword is not ornamental, it is necessary. In times of threat, the feared is called. Local men summoned to defend their land. They are farmers first, fighters second. A plow may be set aside for a spear at a moment's notice. Battles are brutal and uncertain. Victory is not guaranteed by numbers alone, but by morale, terrain, and sometimes sheer luck. Religion anchors the chaos. Christianity has taken root across much of the land, though older pagan beliefs linger in quiet corners. Churches, often simple wooden structures, stand at the center of villages. Bells call people not only to prayer, but to unity. The promise of heaven offers comfort when life on earth is harsh beyond measure. Priests preach obedience and humility, reinforcing social hierarchies that keep order from dissolving completely. Above the peasants stand nobles and kings whose authority is both divine and fragile. A king must prove strength constantly. If he cannot protect his people, loyalty evaporates. Rival claimants emerge. Alliances shift through marriage or betrayal. In this landscape, power is never permanent. Even strong rulers are remembered as much for the battles they survived as for the lands they held. Trade, though limited, connects England to wider worlds. Silver coins change hands, stamped with symbols of authority. Coastal towns exchange goods with the continent, yet these connections are thin threads. A storm, a raid, or a failed harvest can snap them instantly. Isolation remains the default condition. Women bear enormous responsibility within households. They manage food stores, oversee weaving and textile production, brew ale, and maintain the rhythm of domestic survival. In noble households, some wield significant influence, advising husbands and managing estates. In poorer homes, their labor determines whether children see another spring. Children grow into adulthood quickly. There is no prolonged youth. By 12 or 13, boys may train with weapons. Girls may be preparing for marriage. Life expectancy is short. The old are rare and revered, their memories stretching back through times of even greater chaos. Their stories remind younger generations that survival has always required resilience. And yet, amid this hardship, there is endurance. Fields are planted again each spring despite last year's loss. Homes are rebuilt after fire. Communities gather for feasts when harvest allows, sharing salted meat and coarse bread in gratitude for another year surviving. Laughter exists, though it may sound defiant against the backdrop of uncertainty. England in 900 AD is not merely surviving invaders or famine, it is surviving fragmentation. Identity is forming in the crucible of shared struggle. Though kingdoms remain divided, a subtle understanding begins to take shape. That cooperation strengthens defense, that law must be written and enforced, that unity offers safety. But at this moment, at the edge of the 10th century, order has not yet fully returned. It flickers like a candle in a drafty hall, threatened by every gust of wind. Survival depends on vigilance, faith, and the willingness to rebuild again and again. The people of this land do not know that historians will one day call this a turning point. They know only that tomorrow must be faced as fiercely as today. And so, beneath gray skies and over-scarred earth, life continues, not glorious, not romantic, but relentless. England endures, one harsh winter at a time. The chaos did not vanish in a single generation. It tightened its grip before it loosened. Yet somewhere within the smoke of burned halls and the silence of abandoned monasteries, something began to change. Survival was no longer enough. The people of this fractured land needed structure, discipline, and a vision that extended beyond the next harvest. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, foundations were laid that would begin to transform survival into stability. In the South, Wessex emerged not merely as a kingdom fighting for its life, but as a model of adaptation. The memory of relentless Viking incursions had carved hard lessons into its leadership. Defense could no longer be reactive. It had to be organized, calculated, sustained. Fortified towns, Burhs, were expanded and systematically placed so that no settlement was too far from refuge. These were not temporary wooden barricades thrown together in panic. They were planned strongholds, linked by roads, reinforced by coordinated garrisons. The land itself began to reflect intentional order. This restructuring reshaped daily life. Men were no longer called randomly to arms when sails appeared on the horizon. Military service became regulated. Rotations ensured that fields were not abandoned entirely during times of conflict. The field transformed from a desperate militia into a structured defensive force. Responsibility was distributed. Obligation was clear. And clarity, in an age of confusion, was power. Law followed war. Written codes gained renewed importance. Rules regarding theft, loyalty, land disputes, and compensation were formalized. Justice, though still harsh, became less arbitrary. Fines replaced blood feuds in some cases. Authority was tied not only to strength but to governance. Kings who could enforce law fairly gained deeper loyalty than those who ruled through fear alone. The idea that order could be preserved through written word began to take root. Monasteries, once prime targets for plunder, re-emerged as centers of resilience. Behind thickened walls, monks preserved learning and recorded events with careful hands. Latin texts were copied, but increasingly, vernacular language found its place in writing. Knowledge became a weapon of a different kind. Education, limited though it was, cultivated administrators who could manage estates, record taxes, and correspond with neighboring realms. Literacy did not spread widely, but its strategic presence strengthened governance. Trade, cautious at first, resumed within fortified markets. Iron tools, salt, wool, grain, and crafted goods circulated with growing regularity. Coinage gained consistency. Standardized silver pennies reinforced royal authority, stamped with symbols that traveled across regions. Every transaction quietly reinforced the idea of centralized power. Economic revival did not erupt dramatically. It crept forward, transaction by transaction. Agriculture evolved as well. Fields were reorganized more efficiently. Crop rotation practices improved yields in certain regions. Shared plowing systems strengthened communal interdependence. Oxen teams pulled heavier plows across heavier soils, expanding arable land. Surplus, though modest, allowed limited trade rather than mere subsistence. A good harvest no longer meant simple survival. It meant cautious hope. Christianity deepened its influence. The Church offered moral structure and spiritual unity across fragmented territories. Sermons reinforced obedience to lawful authority. Religious festivals provided rhythm to the year, binding communities in shared observance. Churches became places not only of prayer, but of meeting and coordination. In an age where royal authority was still fragile, spiritual authority stabilized social cohesion. Even cultural tension between Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavian settlers began to soften in some regions. Trade requires trust. Intermarriage occurred. Languages borrowed from one another. Norse craftsmanship influenced local design. Law codes sometimes reflected blended customs. What began as violent conquest gradually transformed, in pockets of the land, into coexistence, not harmony, but pragmatic integration. Leadership matured under pressure. Kings learned that unity required more than victory in battle. It required infrastructure. Roads were repaired. Messengers carried directives across growing networks. Taxation systems, though rudimentary, supported defense and administration. Governance shifted from reactive survival toward proactive stability. The throne was no longer merely a symbol of battlefield dominance, it became the center of coordinated authority. Within noble households, estate management grew more sophisticated. Records tracked livestock and harvests. Labor obligations were structured, then were rewarded with land not simply for valor, but for service and loyalty. Land ownership tied power to territory more firmly. Political stability depended increasingly on reliable landholders who maintained order locally. Women continued to hold crucial economic roles. Textile production, brewing, dairy management, and estate oversight sustained households that fueled the broader economy. In some cases, widows managed estates with considerable autonomy. Though society remained hierarchical and male-dominated, competence often carried weight within domestic and estate spheres. The psychological shift may have been the most important transformation of all. For generations, life had been defined by reaction, raid, famine, invasion, retreat. Now, in certain regions, people began planning beyond immediate threats. Burhs were not built for tomorrow's raid alone, but for sustained habitation. Law codes were written not for emergency, but for continuity. Trade agreements implied expectation of future exchange. Fear did not disappear. Viking forces remained formidable in many areas. Northern territories still faced volatility. But a subtle confidence emerged in the south and gradually radiated outward. Communities fortified not only their walls but their systems. Stability began to feel attainable rather than mythical. Young boys training with wooden swords no longer expected only chaos. They saw models of organized defense. Farmers sowed fields with cautious belief that they might reap what they planted. Merchants traveled under guarded routes, trusting structured protection. Monks chronicled events not as isolated disasters, but as chapters in an unfolding story. The transformation was uneven. Some regions lagged behind. Others resisted centralized authority. But momentum had begun. Structure created predictability. Predictability encouraged investment. Investment strengthened infrastructure. And infrastructure reinforced order. England in the early 10th century was still scarred, still wary, still vulnerable. Yet beneath the surface of lingering tension, something stronger than fear was forming. Institutions, systems, shared identity, law, trade, defense, faith. Each thread woven deliberately into a fabric that would hold under strain. The order did not return with fanfare. It returned with planning, with discipline, with cooperation forced by necessity. The people who once survived by instinct were learning to survive by design. And in that shift from reaction to intention, the foundations of a more unified England began to take shape. The transformation did not arrive like a sunrise breaking cleanly over the horizon. It came slowly, unevenly, carried forward by generations who barely understood they were shaping something larger than themselves. Yet by the early decades of the 10th century, a quiet momentum was undeniable. The scattered kingdoms that once struggled in isolation began to recognize that unity was not simply desirable, it was necessary. In the South and Midlands, rulers built upon the foundations already laid. Authority no longer depended solely on battlefield victory, but on sustained governance. Fortified towns became administrative centers. Royal officials moved between them, collecting taxes, settling disputes, and reinforcing law. The idea that one king's command could reach across wide stretches of land gained credibility. Power was consolidating, not through spectacle, but through repetition and enforcement. The decline of large-scale Viking dominance was not absolute nor immediate, but its intensity shifted. Raids grew less frequent in some regions, replaced by settlements and negotiated boundaries. Scandinavian leaders who had once arrived with swords now held land, intermarried, and governed alongside Anglo-Saxon counterparts. Cultural distinctions blurred further. Names, clothing styles, weapon designs, and language intertwined. England was not purging its invaders, it was absorbing them. Coinage became a symbol of this emerging order. Silver pennies circulated more widely, standardized in weight and design. Each coin bore the mark of royal authority, silently declaring that commerce flowed under centralized rule. Markets expanded within fortified towns. Traders from the continent returned more consistently, exchanging goods across the channel. Economic revival strengthened political stability, and political stability reinforced economic growth. Law matured as well. Royal assemblies gathered to deliberate policy and settle disputes. Written codes were revised and expanded. Compensation systems reduced cycles of revenge. Property rights grew clearer. Land charters formalized ownership, tying noble loyalty directly to royal legitimacy. The more predictable the law became, the more confidence it inspired. Stability is not only enforced, it is believed. The Church played a unifying role in this evolving landscape. Bishops traveled between regions, reinforcing shared doctrine and moral expectations. Monasteries continued preserving texts and educating administrators. Christianity provided a spiritual framework that transcended local loyalties. Even as dialects varied and customs differed, shared worship reinforced the idea of belonging to a broader community. Infrastructure quietly strengthened unity. Roads linking Burhs improved communication. Messenger networks operated with increasing efficiency. When threats emerged, responses could be coordinated rather than improvised. Defense shifted from scattered resistance to organized strategy. The land itself felt less fragmented. Psychologically, the people began to think differently about their future. Farmers planted with growing confidence that their fields would not be trampled before harvest. Craftsmen refined their trades beyond mere necessity, producing goods not only for survival but for exchange. Children growing up in fortified towns saw walls that had never fallen in their lifetimes. The memory of chaos remained, but it no longer defined every waking thought. Urban growth, though modest by later standards, hinted at transformation. Market towns expanded within protective ramparts. Workshops lined streets. Taverns buzzed with trade gossip. Administrative buildings housed records and legal proceedings. These towns were not grand cities, yet they embodied something revolutionary for the era: permanence. Leadership adapted further. Kings learned to reward loyalty with structured land grants rather than sporadic spoils. Nobles understood that long-term stability increased their own prosperity. Even warrior culture began to shift. Valor remained respected, but service within organized defense systems gained equal honor. The image of the lone raider gave way to that of the disciplined defender. Diplomacy slowly replaced some warfare. Treaties defined borders. Marriage alliances stabilized regions that once exchanged only blows. Political negotiation, though fragile, reduced bloodshed. England's rulers recognized that unity offered protection not just from Vikings, but from continental ambitions as well. Cultural identity strengthened through shared narrative. Chronicles recorded victories and struggles, shaping collective memory. Stories of resilience spread beyond local villages. A broader concept of belonging emerged, not merely to a tribe or a shire, but to a land increasingly recognized as a single entity. This shift did not erase hardship. Famine still threatened in poor harvest years. Disease still claimed lives without warning. Local disputes persisted. Yet the difference lay in response. Where once chaos fractured communities beyond repair, now systems absorbed shocks and restored equilibrium. The order was not perfect, but it was functional. By mid-century, the vision of a unified England moved from aspiration toward reality. Authority centralized further. Regions that once resisted gradually integrated under structured governance. The language of rule shifted from defensive survival to national stewardship. England was no longer simply enduring the Dark Ages. It was emerging from them. What made this transformation extraordinary was not the triumph of a single king or a single battle. It was the cumulative resilience of countless ordinary people. Farmers who rebuilt after raids, craftsmen who reopened shops, mothers who raised children amid uncertainty, monks who wrote by candlelight, warriors who stood watch on earthen walls. Their persistence created the conditions for order to take root. Looking back, historians might describe this period as transitional, a bridge between chaos and consolidation. But for those living through it, there was no clear dividing line. There was only effort layered upon effort, season after season. Unity was earned in increments measured by harvests, by treaties, by walls that held. By the close of the century, the land that once seemed destined for endless fragmentation stood stronger than it had in generations. A shared identity, though still forming, bound regions together. Law reached farther. Trade moved more freely. Defense operated with coordination. The flickering candle of order burned steadier. England's emergence from the shadows was not inevitable. It was constructed, deliberately, patiently, imperfectly. The Dark Ages did not vanish overnight. They receded as institutions strengthened and cooperation expanded. What began as desperate survival became structured endurance, and structured endurance became the foundation of a nation. In the quiet, after generations of turmoil, something remarkable had occurred. The people who once lived day to day under threat had built systems that outlived fear. Out of fragmentation came unity. Out of the invasion came integration. Out of hardship came resilience strong enough to carry England forward into a new era. And so, when we imagine 900 AD, We should not see only darkness. We should see the hands that rebuilt, the minds that organized, and the communities that refused to dissolve. Order returned, not because chaos faded, but because people shaped something stronger in its place.